Hi, I'm Sally Schenck, Director of the Joy of Painting. You're listening to the medley with Blake Crash Priddle.
Welcome to the medley. I'm Blake Crash Priddle, and today we have a nice happy guest from the set of The Joy of Painting. Former production manager and director Sally Schenck has some amazing stories about her time with artist Bob Ross and how he left behind a huge legacy for everyone. So sit back and relax and grab yourself an iced tea and enjoy this awesome interview. Start by telling us the story of how your career in media started.
I graduated from high school in Missouri, but I went to school in Indiana University, because my father lived in Indiana and he was paying for my education. And I actually started out in nursing and took nursing for a year and a half and then dropped out for a year and worked in a factory because I just couldn't do it. And while I was off, I got into still photography. So I went back to IU in photography, and the first professor really thought I was good, and the second one goes, "No, you're not so good." So then I thought, well, videography is an extension of photography, and I tell people I kind of fell into TV. It wasn't really my first choice, but I loved it once I got into it. And actually, I went out to LA and lived out there for a year and worked at a TV station. And then the cost of living overcame my means when my car from college quit work and I couldn't afford it. So I moved back to Indiana. First job I got was with WIPB as a master control operator. And then I moved my way up to producer director. And I started in January of 82, and then I met Bob in 83. And he actually had done a series on the East Coast, and he was traveling through Muncie. The fairgrounds isn't far from where our studio is, and he happened to see the WIPB studio, and he was giving, his instructional classes, and thought he'd stop by and just see, what we were like. And so to try us out, because he didn't like the crew on the East Coast, I guess I should say that, they wanted to produce him. He didn't want to be produced. He just wanted to do his thing, and then we put it together. So we did a short with him for MTV. And after working with us to do that short, he liked us, and then the rest is history. He switched to us.
And for people that don't know, that's a PBS affiliate that you worked for, right?
Yes, it's become a museum because the first TV studio, was in an old mansion. And later on, about 1988, they built state-of-the-art studios on the Ball State campus. But the little studio where we first worked with Bob, he liked it better because it was just more intimate. But in the wintertime, we'd have to shut off the heat because he was, soft-spoken. So if the pipes were banging in this old mansion, it overpowered his voice. So sometimes the camera people, I started out running camera the first couple of years, we'd have to wear winter coats because we'd have no heat. And then we'd have to tell any office, there was a separate building for offices, but there was a few upstairs. We had to tell them to be real quiet.
I think also because Bob lived in Alaska for a while, I think he might have been used to the cold too.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
I like what he said about Alaska. I really do believe God was having a great day when he created Alaska. Just the things that he said always put a smile on my face.
Yeah, he had a lot of things.
What was it like working with Bob Ross? I can imagine he must have been just a fantastic person to work with.
Yes, I mean, the old saying that you don't want to meet your heroes. Well, that's not true with Bob because he was as nice as he appeared on TV. I mean, he just had so much charisma that, like the staff of the whole station, it was like a family because it wasn't a huge staff. They just always wanted to talk to him. And one day, when I eventually became the director, he pulled me aside and he goes, "Look, I don't want to be mean to these people, but I want to get a lot of shows done today. So you need to be the mean person." And pull me away from these conversations, which, the staff didn't really like me doing that, but he had a really strong work ethic. And of course, he wanted to get the shows done. We would do 13 shows in like 3 to 4 days. I think the record was like 7 in one day, which is, there's 13 in the series. Once we got the first show going, it was kind of just like clockwork because he would only take like a half-hour break to prepare for the next painting in between. But he would always tell the crew a little joke before we got started just to kind of loosen us up. So he had a good sense of humor.
What was your most memorable moment working with Bob Ross? Like, did anything funny happen behind the scenes or anything like that?
Well, yeah, whenever you involve animals on live TV, things are going to happen. The funniest one I remember was one time he brought in a hawk, and when I was director, there was a male camera person and a female camera person, and all of a sudden I heard the woman kind of giggling, and I'm like, "What's going on out there?" Because I'm in the control room, I have no idea what's happening off camera, and she goes, "Well," she's whispering in the headset. She goes, Richard got the hawk out of the cage and it started crawling up his back and he's freaking out, but he can't scream because Bob's on camera. So he finally got the bird over to Bob, but I mean, he was scared to death, but he was like the one that was allotted the task of handing the animals because he had like the wide shot camera, so he didn't have much movement. He mainly gave Bob the cues and did things like that. So he had to be the one to hand him the animals, which he brought in a lot of different ones. In fact, there was a rescue place. Her name was Diane Schaefer. I went with Bob sometimes to go pick out animals to bring on the show. He had owls and of course squirrels. I mean, he, as a child, would rescue animals and bring them into his home and take care of them and then put them back out in the wild. And one time I went to visit him in Florida and lo and behold, he had a squirrel he had rescued in his house.
That squirrel's name was Peapod, right?
Well, yeah, that he had a lot of peapods over the years, but yeah, that was his pet name for them.
That's a great
But
name.
yeah, now every time I see a squirrel, I think of Bob. It's like not that I ever would have run over him before, but now I'm like hitting my brakes and doing everything I can because I always think of Bob when I see squirrels now. But yeah, he loved nature, and I would say a few years into the doing the series with him, I knew he was part American Indian. His mother was part Cherokee. I said, "How come you don't share that with people on the show?" And he goes, "Well, that's private." He was kind of private about his private life. But years later, he finally, and I was shocked on a show, he admitted that he was part American Indian. But I think that kind of like spoke of his love of animals and taking care of our world and the beauty of pointing out the beauty of the world in his paintings.
One thing I noticed on The Joy of Painting is that he would occasionally tease you. Sometimes he would say things like, you can take your time doing this. I have to hurry because otherwise the director will get mad at me.
Yeah, he called me the first time he called me mean old director. He called me. I went out there and I had my hands on my hip and I'm like, Bob, why would you call me mean? I'm not. I mean, who could be mean to Bob Ross? I said, I'm not mean to you. And he goes, oh, Sally. He goes, I just want to see how many little old ladies write me letters. And sure enough, he started getting letters from these little old ladies saying, you tell that director not to be mean to you.
But he also said on one episode, I'm just kidding. She's actually a very nice person.
Oh, I must have missed that one.
Yeah, I saw that on
Yeah.
one of the episodes. And one of my favorite Bob Ross moments was when he told the story about how he had a little lapel mic on that didn't have any wires on. And just before doing a demonstration out in public, he went to the bathroom and he forgot it was on. With the wireless mic, when I came back, everyone knew where I'd been. Even worse, what I've been doing.
Yeah. I remember that too. Yeah. Well, I mean, you don't think about that kind of stuff sometimes. But yeah, he was funny. I'll never forget when I went to I really didn't know how well he wasn't when he first started as popular, of course, as he has ended up being. But I'll never forget one time I went to Central Park with him, and they had the PBS station in New York City had a day for kids. They had Sesame Street characters, they had Mister Rogers characters, and then they had Bob Ross. And I was so shocked when I saw all these people just crowding around him. He did a painting and everything, and they'd bring their paintings to show of him because they were so proud. And I'm talking a lot of kids, but there was also adults there too. So I would stop them, and I took a smaller camera with me, and I videotaped them holding up their paintings, and they're all just so proud. And they had Bob like sign the back, and then I edited it all together and put it on the next series, but I'll never forget this little girl. She's like way off the distance, and she screams at the top of her lungs. She must have been like 8 years old. She goes, "Mommy, mommy, it's Bob Ross!" And she tore through the crowds, and it was all that mother could do was to keep up with her, because she was more excited about seeing Bob Ross than the Sesame Street characters or Mr. Rogers characters. That really kind of shocked me.
That's so nice, though, and that he had an impact on his younger fans too. I do remember seeing that mashup of video clips from when he visited New York. I think that might have been the one where he actually painted a picture from the perspective of Central Park with the skyscrapers and everything in the background, which I thought was really cool.
Hmm. Yeah, because he didn't do buildings. Well, just the little cabins. He didn't like doing people. I was shocked one time he did a little man by a fire pit out in camping or whatever, but he wasn't real proud of it because, it was more like a stick figure. Well, I'd rather see the landscapes anyway rather than people. I mean, the beauty of nature and like when he would do like the aurora borealis in Alaska, I just thought that was gorgeous.
It was. And there were times on the show where he would, paint something, really big, like a big tree or a big barn or something, and then he would say, "I know what you're thinking, Bob. What have you done this time?" But he always managed to make it look great.
Oh yeah, yeah, it was the infamous. I'd give him a 2 minute cue, and he'd go, "Okay, now it's time to put in a big old tree." And after all the shows I was involved with, running camera or directing, I never stopped getting nervous that he'd get it done, but he always did. There was one time though, I went out into the studio afterwards because we always kind of talked about it afterwards, and I said, "Well, Bob, are you happy with the painting?" He goes, "Oh yeah." "Why? What's wrong, Sally?" And I said, "You forgot to take the contact paper off." It was like an oval. And so what we did, that was the only time that I can recall anyway, ever doing an edit on his show. But we had to coordinate everybody because they were great 1 inch tapes, that we had rolling on a big reel. And we would double tape it, tape two of them as a backup. And we had to coordinate, him cueing, and we took like a tight shot of him dabbling on something at the bottom of the painting, and then went to the white shot and he took the contact paper off. But I enjoyed catching him making a mistake.
I recall reading somewhere that when Bob would do a painting, he would often do, I think, three different versions of each painting. Like one would be used for an animation sequence at the beginning of the show, and then one would be off camera to use as a reference, and then he would paint another version on camera. Is that true?
He didn't do it forever because I remember one time it was like all of a sudden there wasn't a painting off to the side. But yeah, I'd say the first part of his series, he would have a painting he did ahead of time, which would be more detailed because you just can't get that detailed in 26 minutes. And then you paint the one on the show, and then he would do a third one because they would take still shots of it for his instructional books because he did an instructional book for every series. So yeah, there was three paintings and then eventually just two paintings for every show. Or if he did one ahead of time, he didn't bother bringing it off to the side anymore because, after so many paintings, he didn't really need to.
Have you ever tried painting pictures yourself?
Well, the first time I did was in 2019 when Steve, his son, his best friend Dana Jester were finally allowed to go out and teach classes again because it was part of the lawsuit that they couldn't. But the lawyers finally determined that they were on enough shows that they had the right to use the words joy of painting. So it was like a reunion because I hadn't seen either of them for like years. And I was still working full time at the time. So I came in the afternoon and Steve had painted the mountains for me. And I said, "Well, how did you know I was going to show up?" He goes, "I knew you would." So I painted the rest of it. So I have a half Steve Ross and a half Sally Schenck painting. And then another time I went back for one of the classes, but I didn't do very well. Just because I watched the show, all those shows doesn't mean I had the ability to do a good job. So I go back to the workshops just to see people because it's just, I mean, I can kind of feel the vibe when I walk into those workshops. Everybody's just so into it. And of course, getting to see Steve and Dana.
Did you ever anticipate that Bob Ross would have the cult following that he has now? Because from what I recall reading, the show was originally just going to be a show to promote his art classes, and it turned into a huge
Yeah.
cult following with merchandise and everything.
Well, yeah, they mainly did it for the classes, and they sold the books, and they sold the supplies, right? And it really didn't become I mean, before he died, it was in different countries, because I remember he traveled to Japan and he told me, Sally, that's the most afraid I've ever been, because the crowd just like smashed him up against a wall and pressed him up against the wall. And he said, I didn't know what to do. I was trapped. So I know it was in some of the countries before he died, but I think that it going on Netflix and Twitch and Hulu, it just exploded after that, because a whole new generation discovered him. And then during the pandemic, I had people reach out even from England and said we'd never even seen him before, but it really helped us through this because he's so calming. And I say he's like the Fred Rogers of painting. He just has that soft voice and, reassuring, and he's so positive, and it's what people really needed. So one time in Dallas, and I went somewhere else, but I can't remember where. But anyway, you'd have a suite for your show, right? So I would stand there and pass out little Bob Ross trinkets or whatever, and talk to the program managers and try to get them to carry his show early on. And I'll never forget one time, William Alexander was on the floor below us, and Bob goes, Sally, he goes, I can't go down there because he's mad at me, right? But he's got this palette knife I really want because it's gold colored. It's got his name etched on it. And he goes, you go down there because he won't know who you are. So I went down there and got him one, and got one for myself, and I still have it.
And Bill Alexander, he was the
Yeah.
artist that inspired him and taught him, right?
Well, yeah, the wet on wet technique he actually learned from Bill Alexander. And I can remember us airing PSAs where Bill Alexander is standing there with Bob, and he goes, I'm retiring, and I'm handing my almighty brush over to Bob Ross to keep teaching the wet on wet technique. So he retired for a while. And then what Bob told me is that Bob got so much more popular just because Bob had the personality and the talk. The other guy was kind of gruff and, didn't have all these witticisms that Bob had. And so he got kind of jealous of Bob, and he ended up starting his show and going back on TV.
What did you work on after The Joy of Painting finished its run?
Well, we always had projects in PBS, but I actually ended up quitting in not that long after he passed away, and went down to the Indianapolis, Indiana TV station, which was called WFYI. And then I eventually got out of television just because I worked a lot of weekends and a lot of nights, a lot of early mornings. It was hard to have a personal life. But yeah, we missed Bob. It really just wasn't the same for me after he passed away, because it was like losing a family member. You don't work with somebody like that and not become their friend.
What kind of projects are you working on as of now?
Well, I semi-retired. I only stayed in television until about 1999, because I ended up going to sales so I could have a normal hours. So my last job, it's just a small company that does like coupon magazines. So I was going to retire totally, but I don't know how it is up in Canada, but down here you can't get people to work. So they begged me to stay part-time. So I just said, okay, I'll work Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday afternoons. That way I can still have like 4-day weekends and have leisurely mornings, not rush to work every morning. So that's what I'm doing now.
Yeah, the work ethic here in Nova Scotia is pretty darn high. I mean, there's lots of young lobster fishermen here that seem to like their jobs.
Well, I mean, I was raised by Canadian parents, and they really instilled a strong work ethic in me. Like my father was in the Canadian Air Force, and during World War II, went to fight in World War II and became part of the English Air Force, and he flew Spitfires. So he was very proud of that. So when he passed away, I donated a lot of his Air Force things to a museum in Hamilton, Ontario.
And my parents, they instilled a work ethic in me as well, because we used to live out in the country on an old abandoned farm, and there was no animals for us to look after, but there was always something to do, grass to be cut, pieces of wood to be picked up. But where we lived, it was a
Hmm.
great place for an artist to do some painting, and I think Bob Ross would have been right at home there.
Yeah,
I
I
know
think
that.
we used to camp a lot. So we went to Nova Scotia once. It was beautiful.
Oh, it sure is. I know that you were interviewed in a documentary about Bob Ross, which I believe was called Happy Accidents, Betrayal, and Greed. For people that don't know, what was that documentary all about?
Well, it's an unfortunate thing that happens to a lot of people that are in business. It was Bob and his wife, and then the two Kowalskis, so it was two couples. So they signed an agreement that they would each have 25% share. Well, then Bob's wife died, and all of a sudden he only has 33%. So look what happens. I mean, they got control of him, and they didn't always agree. And Bob, to the day he died, refused to sign a piece of paper that gave the rights to his image. Other than the paint supplies and the books and the show, the rest was go to his son and his I think his half brother, right? And instead of that happening, the Kowalskis, like you said earlier, sold all these merchandising products, which they had no right to. And I'm not sure how it happened, but in the Steve and Steve's uncle tried to fight it, and I think the uncle gave in and took a settlement without telling Steve. So Steve gets not one penny from it, which I really didn't know because I kind of lost touch with Steve after Bob died. It's just a sad story.
The way that I look at it myself is that Bob Ross still brought a lot of joy to other people, and he, made people feel better about themselves, whether you were watching it to de-stress after school or you were wanting to become a better artist. He taught people that you could. And I was
Yeah.
always taught to try to look at the positive sides of things that happened in life. And without a doubt, I think regardless of everything that happened on the business side of things, Bob's legacy, I don't think will ever change.
No, that's what I mean. His shows are evergreen. I mean, there's still people out there that don't even know he's died because, they just keep watching his shows. And yeah, I know he's helped a lot of people because I had people reach out to me. Like one guy was suicidal until he discovered the show, and another woman was, and I think I told the producers about her because she ended up on the show. She was just devastated by the loss of her child, and she just started watching his show, and it kind of like helped her through her grief. And you've probably seen, I've seen like news segments on where like a whole classroom of middle school students dressed up as Bob Ross put his show on a big screen, and they all painted together. I mean, it's just amazing, um, what he's done for people, because even if you don't like to paint, he's just interesting to listen to and watch. It's like magic seeing the, painting appear. I remember he used to get letters that said, "I turn your show on so I can go to sleep." And I said, "Well, Bob, doesn't that offend you?" He goes, "No, Sally. If I can help somebody do anything, including sleep, then I'm glad I'm there for him." I mean, because he was just that type of person.
I just thought of something else. When I introduced the show to my mom, I showed it to her after school one day when I was a kid, and I said, "There's this painting show that I really like watching, and it's an older show, I think. I think it's from the 80s." And she says, "Yeah, I can tell. The guy's hairdo is outdated."
Yeah. Yeah, he did it at first to save money, and then once they started his product line, he had no choice but to keep it because he didn't really like it. Soon after I met him, he was like, "I don't really like it, but I'm stuck with it now." He didn't have a choice, so yeah, it was kind of outdated, but yeah, he originally did it just to save money, get a perm, and then not have to cut it for a while.
That's why I cut my own hair. Like, I haven't gone to a barber shop since the pandemic. Like, I just do it myself.
I quit dyeing my hair during the pandemic. I'm like, screw it, I don't care anymore.
Have you ever had any of your own ideas for TV shows?
No, I was too busy working to think about creative ideas. I mean, they allowed us to, like when I was a producer director, I really liked dogs, and I felt bad about the overpopulation, so I did a pet care series that I did all on my own. Uh, videotaped it with a host, and then went around to different topics and produced my own shows. And but it was also difficult to do. Was a precursor to the Ironman triathlon here in Muncie. So we had to videotape people swimming the first leg of the journey, then bicycling, and then running. So I had like maybe 4 camera people out, including myself, with like cameras on our shoulders, and then bring all that videotape back and then trying to get them in sequence. It was probably the most challenging thing I'd ever edited and put together in my life. So I also had interviews with some of the participants. Some of them I interviewed ahead of time and then tried to find them during the race, and then interviewing people after the race and getting it all down to like 1 hour.
Do you have any tips for people that want to become TV directors or people that want to make their own documentaries or a series similar to The Joy of Painting?
Well, just it takes a lot of funding. I mean, it may have changed since I was in TV. It's probably a lot easier, but first coming up with an idea that nobody else has done, I really wouldn't know what to tell people these days, because when I was in television, there weren't as many streaming channels and all these other choices. So I wouldn't know how you would go about getting something on TV these days. I mean, I was lucky with PBS. They would let us do some of our own things just because we were a small station. I just don't think people realize how much work it is to put together a show. Now, Bob's show, that was easy because we just had a black backdrop. But I mean, if you're editing a show and putting it together, there's a lot of behind the scenes things, and a lot of work goes on. So I mean, I could appreciate it because I used to do it myself, but I just think the average person watching TV just has no clue how many people it takes to put that show on the air. I used to enjoy doing live events. Like I would direct Ball State basketball. We'd go to out of town games because that's fast paced, and I'm from Indiana, so we like basketball. But I got to do things like I got to direct a boys choir in Cincinnati, Ohio. In Richmond, Indiana, I got to do an opera, and of course live pledge breaks, and then we had in the WIPB we'd have live auction, which was a lot of fun. Like all kinds of businesses would donate items, and including Bob Ross. Every year he would donate a painting, and back then they would go for like maybe 700 to 1,000, and now his paintings are worth like anywhere from $15,000 to $20,000.
Well, Sally, thank you so very much for your time today. It was great to have you on the show, and thank you so much for sharing your amazing memories with Bob Ross, too.
You're welcome. I enjoy talking about him.
And that was Sally Schenck, former director and production manager of The Joy of Painting with Bob Ross. You can learn more about Bob Ross on the 2021 documentary Bob Ross, Happy Accidents, Betrayal, and Greed, now streaming on Netflix. But don't let the name fool you, because it also tells the story about how this amazing artist created an evergreen legacy. That's all the time we have. And remember, we're all kinds of different.